Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending to my presentation. The objective of this talk is to demystify Agile, Scrum, and especially story points, explaining why they work and showing how they can be adapted to fit the team, rather than simply instructing on a rigid system. In this presentation, I hope to provide a basic overview of fundamentals, conceptual understanding, and practical suggestions to help teams understand what value these systems can add to their workflows. Before we dive in, a couple of quick disclaimers. First, everything I'm sharing today is my own insight based off my personal experience, research, and judgment. The conclusions I have drawn are my own and should be examined critically. None of what I say should be treated as a mandate. Rather, I encourage you to think of it as a way to start thinking about these systems. Second, Agile and Scrum aren't one size fits all. There's no magic formula. It takes some trial and error, a bit of tinkering, and time to figure out what actually clicks for your group. One final bit of disclaiming. This is not a how to Scrum class. I won't be covering the full Scrum framework, and I won't expect anyone to walk out of here ready to launch a Scrum team from scratch. Rather, this presentation focuses on the why behind this, why these systems work, why they're built the way they are, and why they matter. Because without that understanding, in my humble opinion, you can't really adapt them to your context. You can't use them to their full potential. John Gall, author of Systematics, How Systems Work and Especially How They Fail, wrote, "A complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be patched up to make it work. You have to start over, beginning with a working, simple system." While Gall is saying this in reference to system creation, I feel it is also true when it comes to system implementation. You can't implement a complex system without understanding the simple working system at its core. That being said, before we get into the system itself, we first need to explain what problem the system is coming to solve. Allow me to introduce you to Agile. I sometimes find the easiest way to understand Agile is to compare it to the traditional way of doing things, often called waterfall. On the left, you'll see a waterfall process. It's very step by step. First, you gather all the requirements. Then you design everything. Then build it all. Then test it all. And finally, only then deliver it. There's little room to go back. Each phase depends on the one before it being fully complete. Now, this approach can work well and is in fact necessary sometimes. In construction, for example, when building a building, you need to know the full plan first before working on anything. You can't build the 10th floor without being certain of how the foundation is laid out. You absolutely need to wait to start construction until you are sure what you are building. The cost of trying something you are unsure of is far more massive than delaying to confirm the plan. Software development, however, is the opposite. In software development, the cost of delay almost always exceeds a comparable development investment. Often, trying something that ends up being a failure helps accelerate and inform the path to success. Waterfall would be wastefully rigid and sequential. Instead, we should develop iteratively and be flexible with change. New ideas can come up, plans can shift. That's where Agile comes in. On the right, you can see an example of how an Agile framework, in this case Scrum, works. Instead of full phrases, this framework relies on short, repeatable cycles. We plan just enough to get started, build a small slice, test it, review it, and then decide what to do next. This means we are constantly learning and adjusting rather than sticking to a rigid plan. This brings us to the quote on the bottom. Waterfall follows a map, Agile follows a compass. Waterfall says we know exactly where we're going and how we'll get there. Agile says we know the direction and will adjust our path as we learn. I mentioned Agile is a philosophy. It's a way of thinking about how we work. In 2001, a group of 17 like-minded software developers published the Agile Manifesto, seen here on the right-hand side as an adaptive way of doing software development. The operative word here being adaptive. Agile is a development methodology that explicitly targets handling development with dynamic, indeterministic, and nonlinear properties. Agile does this by emphasizing the following values: people over tools and processes, delivering value early in small, meaningful pieces, sometimes referred to as slices, collaboration, not just with your team, but with customers and stakeholders too, and above all, being flexible, embracing change rather than fighting it. These values guide how agile teams operate. It's not saying that process, documentation, and plans are bad or aren't important. It's just that when it comes down to it, we value the stuff on the left hand side more. In Agile, we don't wait for perfect requirements before we start. We assume we'll be working with incomplete information and that things will change as we learn more. Rather than trying to eliminate that uncertainty, Agile is about thriving within it. To be clear, Agile does not mean move fast and break things. It means move smart and adjust quickly. Teams absolutely still do plan, test, and track that work. But if something changes, and it usually does, Agile teams can respond quickly without throwing everything away and starting over. We can think of delivery styles on a spectrum from predictive to adaptive. Waterfall leans predictive, while Agile leans adaptive. This shows up in how we plan. In Waterfall, scope is fixed, and time and resources flex to hit that scope. We know the exact or close to it requirements of the project at the onset and manipulate the resources and time to get that result. In Agile, time and team are fixed, short iterations and a stable team, and scope flexes based on what we learn. We have the team, fixed resources, deliver something every 2 weeks. We are willing to manipulate that something to match these other two. This is the practical expression of Agile living in ambiguity. We commit to a cadence and a capacity, and we treat scope as something we can refine as we discover more. So, Agile is this flexible philosophy which embraces change and accepts that we don't have perfectly concrete information up front. Here's the thing, while that flexibility is great and the point of Agile, it comes with a big trade off: uncertainty. As we often don't get all those requirements up front, they're not really crystal clear. This makes traditional planning and budgeting with exact timelines and precise estimates ineffective. What we need is a new way of thinking and planning that lives in this uncertainty. That's where story points come in. So let's talk about story points, because this is one of those agile terms that almost everyone's heard, but few teams interpret the same way. Story points are a way for a team to estimate how much effort a piece of work is relative to other work. The effort of a task includes how complex it is, how big it is. For example, making 100 buttons is not much more complex than one button, but it sure is a lot bigger, and risk/uncertainty. These factors correspond to an increase in the effort of the task, and more effort means more story points. Now, a really crucial bit that gets misconstrued a lot, in my humble opinion, is this: story points have no inherent meaning. I'll expound more on this point in a later slide, but it's a very integral part of why story points work. A 5 isn't a time box and it isn't a universal size. Points only mean something in comparison to other work for this team right now. A 5 is bigger than a 3 and it's smaller than an 8. That's it. You can't convert them to hours and you can't carry their meaning across teams. So you might be wondering, what's the point of them then? No pun intended. If a story point doesn't mean anything in terms of time boxing and they don't measure performance, what are they good for then? The answer is that they are good at exactly what they are designed for: measuring and communicating relative effort to the team. It's precisely this lack of objective definition that is what makes them useful. Their subjective, nebulous nature allows them to be, psychologically speaking, useful. Let's dig in a little bit as to why. You might have heard of Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, a book about the power of intuitive judgment. His idea is that we often make surprisingly accurate decisions in a snap without needing all of the information. Just to demonstrate the concept, the book begins with the story of the Getty Kuros. The Kuros was a statue brought to the J. Paul Getty Museum in California. Standard battery of scientific and art tests practically confirmed the statue to be authentic. But when experts first looked at it, their initial responses were skeptical. For example, George Despens, head of the Acropolis Museum in Athens, is quoted as saying, "Anyone who has ever seen a sculpture coming out of the ground could tell that this thing has never been in the ground." When pressed, Despens and others couldn't pinpoint what exactly tipped them off. They just had an intuition. Sure enough, over time, the letters vouching for the statue's authenticity were disproven, and the museum eventually took it off display. The experts' intuitions were right on the money, even if their analytical minds couldn't identify the precise why. This intuition is exactly what story points are tapping into. Remember, when a team assigns story points, they are not calculating hours. They are specifically bypassing this analytical mind which tries to make fixed logical evaluations. Instead, they're relying on calibrated intuition. using that gut instinct that can be so, so powerful. By thin slicing size, complexity, and uncertainty based on past experience, the team can evaluate effort even in ambiguous, volatile work. Over time, teams get really good at this. Their gut becomes trained, and when that happens, pointing becomes fast, consistent, and reliable, even if it ends up not being precise in a mathematical sense. One point that often confuses people is the relative nature of story points. I'll get asked, how much is three story points? The answer is that it's three times bigger than one story point. Okay, then, well, how big is one story point? It's half of two story points. Story points by design aren't a fixed value at all. They're relative proportional measurements. This idea isn't new. Psychologists and decision researchers have studied it for decades. One of the main findings from Why Plans Fail and others is that humans are terrible at absolute estimation. We're wired to judge by comparison, not by objective measurement. If I were to hold up two objects, let's say a pencil and a ruler, and I were to ask how long the pencil is, most people would hesitate to guess. Maybe it's 7 inches, 18 centimeters. Unless you use a ruler, you're going to have a hard time knowing exactly how big it is. But if I hold up another object and I compare them side by side and I ask which is longer, no hesitation, no debate. You can tell at a glance, relatively speaking, which one is larger. The truth is, when we estimate tasks, we do exactly this in our heads. We compare one piece of work to another, not to a stopwatch. So rather than forcing ourselves to predict the absolute time, something we know humans are bad at, story points let us lean to how we naturally think. We compare this story to that story, this task to that task. Relative sizing sidesteps the planning fallacy by focusing on proportions and not absolute predictions. This is what makes story points far, far, far more useful. Not because they're objectively right, but because they're consistently useful for forecasting. There's a famous quote from statistician George Box that I think captures this idea really well. All models are wrong, but some are useful. The point of Scrum and of story points isn't to give us perfectly objective answers. Frankly, no system could do that. The Agile philosophy accepts that our work lives in uncertainty and volatility. The real value is that these systems help us navigate that ambiguity and make better decisions within it. They don't work because they're correct. They're correct because they work. So, now that we know what story points are and how they work, how do we actually use them as a team? One of the most common and effective ways is something called planning poker. It's a team based way of estimating effort using story points. Everyone gets a set of cards with numbers like 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8. For each story, everyone secretly picks a card showing how much effort they think it'll take, and then we all reveal at the same time. The magic isn't in the cards, it's in what happens after. When people have different estimates, it sparks conversation. Someone might have thought of a risk or a dependency that others may not have considered. This works so well because you get multiple perspectives. Different roles see different parts of the work. This also encourages discussion. You'll learn where your assumptions are or gaps might be. It also builds cohesion. Everyone gets invested in the outcome, even if they're not the one coding that story. Their voice is still heard. I'm going to run through a couple of examples that can hopefully illustrate the intuitive gut decision making we are looking to target here. First example, how many story points of effort do you think preparing a table for a Friday night meal might be? You probably have come up with some sort of estimate. Some of you may have come up with a 2, as it's relatively easy. Some of you might have come up with a 5 or an 8, as it's overwhelming to set the table for so many people. That's fine. It's not the individual story point value that matters. It's how it works relative to other tasks. So let's look at other tasks. All right, cleaning the dishes. Everyone's favorite task. I'll be honest, if you gave this one a 1 or a 2, I want to have you at my house at some point. Most people are going to give this one a bit of a higher estimate than the previous task, which is the point. We're looking at relative measurements. We're looking at tasks being weightier or less weighty than others. Let's look at one more. Shopping for groceries. Okay, the requirements of this one might be a little bit ambiguous and a little bit vague. How many groceries are we shopping for? How many people are we shopping for? And that might affect the story pointing. Sometimes you won't have those precise requirements. So go with your gut. Is this harder or easier than, let's say, doing all of those dishes that you saw? Go with an instinctive judgment, and that will help inform the other decisions as well. Final one, how much effort is reading the EOS book? As all of us, I'm sure, have done this 100% of the time, we all know precisely how much effort it takes. And probably it falls somewhere in the middle of the rest. Maybe a little bit harder than shopping, but a little bit easier than the dishes. Either way, as each of these tasks came on the screen and you hopefully thought about what value we would ascribe to it, you started to get an understanding of how you end up viewing the effort of these tasks. Each one of those, you'll be able to put a value on a number that says, relative to other tasks, how much is this? Okay, there's one final piece of the puzzle that I want to connect to. We know why story points work and a practical method to story point a task. The final step involves the team and how it absorbs those story point tasks. How does the team use these superpowered, amazingly great effort estimates? I want to introduce you to velocity. Velocity, in terms of definition, is very simple. It's the number of story points completed in a time period, what was often called a sprint. This is the crock pot in which we cook our story point challenge. The trick with velocity is similar to story points themselves, it needs to be adaptable and malleable in order to account for the agile uncertainty factor. Therefore, a team's velocity does not stay fixed. It constantly shifts as the actual work completed reframes our picture of how much capacity the team can handle. It's not fixed, 100% certain value. Rather, it's a drifting prediction that gives us an estimate with which we can forecast into the future. I want to put this all together with an illustration that shows why iterating with these metrics helps the system come together as a powerful prediction tool. Anyone who has a background in science or statistics will probably recognize this visual. When discussing how good a test is at predicting results, we talk about wanting to have both high precision and high accuracy. High precision but low accuracy means you're getting these massively scattered answers that basically don't tell you anything. The average will still tell you the right answer, but with such a high margin for error on each individual measurement, it's practically unusable. This would be if I stood on a scale and got a 190 one time, a 220 another time, 180 a third time, and 200 a fourth time. The average is correct, but each measurement is just way too unreliable. Conversely, with high precision but low accuracy, you're getting a precise same answer over and over again. But because there's something systematically wrong with the test, you're getting the same wrong answer over and over again. It's like that scale again, but this time it just always shows my weight as 10 pounds too light. If I step on it 5 times and it shows 190 every time, it's precise, but it's just not accurate. In Scrum, we can think of velocity and story point accuracy, or how good a guess was our story point evaluation, as accuracy and precision, respectively. Velocity is the center of our target. When we're off target, we are over or underestimating the number of story points the team could do. As we keep iterating and rechecking our average, we get closer and closer to our team's true capacity. Similarly, story point accuracy is how tight that grouping is. The better our story pointing, the more accurate our effort estimates. As we iterate, both of these get better. And when they get good, we have an incomparably powerful tool useful for forecasting in an agile, uncertain environment. It's our secret sauce, our secret weapon for being able to get precise forecasting in a imprecise and uncertain requirements environment. Thank you so much for listening. In conclusion, I want to review what we've seen in this presentation. We haven't covered all the parts of Scrum, of course, but I think the conclusions we pulled out of there are still incredibly powerful for using and implementing these systems. Agile is a development philosophy that embraces ambiguous scope as the best and most efficient way to develop software. Story points are a useful tool that take advantage of human psychological traits to forecast in an ambiguous environment. And iterating over these systems, using them over and over and over again, and correcting them over and over and over again makes them become powerful and makes them useful. I have a final slide that has all my references. I'll be sharing this out with anyone who asks. It'll also be available on the course that you're on. Thank you so much for listening, and reach out to me with any and all questions.